First up, we have Angela's. The last comment that she got from Haji was to brighten the shadows and make them redder. And I can see that. I can see how in this version we have gone from gray shadow, and it's not quite gray, but you can see it's not as saturated as it could be. It's gone to that, which is a little bit more saturated. You see it's moved up towards the screen right, so that makes it more saturated. But I think we have room to go even more saturated. So I think what Haji is referring to can be translated from like a lighting perspective into adding a wrap. So we are accustomed to thinking of lights as maybe very small dots that are very bright, and then when they stop being bright, they just suddenly stop, right? But lights are usually a little fuzzier than that, meaning that even a small light source tends to have a little bit of a halo around it. So that means that it's very difficult in real life to find fully sharp shadows. There's usually some kind of bleed effect. And that can be for many reasons. Usually it's because the light is made of several parts. There's a very bright core, which could be a light bulb, and around it there's like a diffuser of some kind, right? So that tends to provide some extra color and information around the terminator angle. How do you replicate that? So you see how much of a difference that's making. Now the light source feels a little bit more diffuse. Well, this is essentially a wrap light. So you can take your key and you would just duplicate it and make it a little wider, a little softer. And then you would move it ideally in the position where you want the light to wrap. But even just duplicating the key and making it a little bit dimmer and bigger will just diffuse it. And you can give it a try and see what that does. But essentially we're trying to add a little bit of color on the transition so it doesn't go gray, and lift some shadows so that before they roll into the shadows there's a little bit of extra color. So we don't want to lose the contrast that we had before. I think the contrast was good, especially looking at the reference. We just want to make sure that before it goes darker, it gets a little bit more saturated and red, if that makes sense. So we want to regain some of that. But whereas before it might have been just dark, we want to make sure that we pick the color from the most saturated area of the color palette. So like if I color pick this area, you can see it's very gray. In this area, it's like almost gray. So we want to go in there and make sure that our darkest area is actually saturated red, right? And now you can see how we're getting closer to the reference. In the reference, as we get closer to the shadows, it gets redder and redder, right? You can see how it's in the midtones, saturation-wise, and then as we get darker, it moves closer and closer to the fullest amount of saturation it can get. Okay? So again, we're gonna go here, make it darker, more saturated. Yep, like that. So that would be my first note. To go a little further in pushing the saturation, we really want to avoid the character feeling gray in the shadows. Right? Then his ears are looking a little bit like chicken, like when it's backlit. Like if you had a chicken for too long in the fridge, it tends to look kind of orangish like that. So if we look at the reference, his ears are going very red when backlit, right? So we want to do the same thing, because that's essentially telling us that there's blood inside those ears, and when they're backlit, you can see the blood shining through, right? Once it goes orange, it will feel like maybe he's like a character made of wax, but like it doesn't feel fleshy. So we want to make sure that we have that color. And that might mean that you have to go back into the surfacing for the character and adjust the scatter color, or I'm not sure what software you're using, but you want to make sure that you have the color variety. Some shaders allow you to set a different color for different depth, meaning that a shallow depth might be orange to indicate shallow skin, but then as it travels deeper into the skin, it gets redder. So that might be something you might want to look into. But now I'm literally just color picking the exact hues that we have in the reference and bringing them into your image. Okay. And this may be a little bit pushed, but you get the idea. This might be a little too bright. Right. So this is what we have done so far. We've introduced more saturation, more reds, and made those ears a little bit more like they're backlit and have more red in them. Okay. All right. So next up, this is not really like a reference to image comment. It's more like a general comment. In animation, we tend to deviate compared to live action in terms of the read on the eyes. In animation, we tend to want the eyes to stand out and be a little bit more neutral. And I believe this is a matter of appeal. And obviously, it's not what happens in real life, right? Real life, the eyes would just go dark if there's no light. But in animation, we tend to keep them a little bit artificially lifted. So I'm gonna go in here and just lift them up a little bit. Even when they go in shadows, I'll still lift them up a little bit. And it can be tricky to find a right balance, so it doesn't feel like his eyes are like shooting forward. So you might want to play with the transparency. You may want to play with his nuke essentially to find a good balance between what should happen and what will tend to make the eyeballs a little bit cleaner. This is one of the things that we tend to spend a lot of time looking at. Teeth, eyes, anything that gets a lot of screen time that the audience tends to pay attention to. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure it has appealing hues. All right, so now we're going from that to that. And a full transparency, it's too strong, but you can kind of play with the transparency of the layer until you find something that feels natural, right? So I think something like around 40 or 50%, this starts to feel good. All right. Okay. So I'm noticing that his hair is feeling a little dark. Like this is literally black. There's literally no information here. As much as we can, let's try to stay away from full blacks. And let's try to add some information on the hair. So I'm gonna just go in and do some like graphical specular highlight. And you don't have to match it one to one, but I would just make sure that there is some specular information in there. It might be subtle, but just something to add some information. Ooh, what did I just add some information in there, right? And I'm gonna blur this a lot, so it's pretty subtle. And it's meant to just represent a specular hit, right? We can make it a little bit darker, we can make it maybe cooler. We can find a good temperature that makes it sit in the image. Something like that. And we can play with the opacity too. We just need enough information to show that this is hair, there's hair in here, and this is a specular highlight, essentially. Okay. Next up, I think we want to make his skin feel a little bit more shiny. Like if you look at DiCaprio's nose, there's like a nice juicy highlight. There's some nice highlight on his lips. And in here, it feels like we're looking mostly at diffuse information. So specular information does not care about the local color. So even though the skin might be, pink, our specular highlight is going to be the temperature of the light. It's going to ignore completely the local color. So we want to paint the temperature of the light. We don't want it to be affected by the local color of the character. And we want to take areas of the skin that are a little oilier, that would catch a highlight. And if you have access to the surfacing for the character, this would translate essentially into painting a roughness map. And in a roughness map, the darker areas are shinier, and the brighter areas are less shiny. So you want to go on those areas where I'm painting highlights right now, and making those a little darker. You can use a brush, you can use a gradient like a radial. It doesn't have to be specific to, it can be very broad. That's what I'm trying to say. You can just make a whole area a little darker or a little brighter. They should give you some more variety. And I'm gonna blur them just so they're not quite as obvious. And maybe play with the opacity again. We just want to make it a little shinier, right? So you can see before and after it's feeling a little shinier. Now, if his skin were shinier, we probably would catch some speck on his field side. We don't see it here, but I think it would make a good addition. So even though it's on his field side, why don't we grab something that looks like it could be a field side color and add some specular highlight in there. And we can desat it so it sits a little better. And again, cut saturation, cut some of the opacity. Just paint something that can make it feel like his skin has a oily quality to it. It's not just matte. There's some specularity component to it, right? And this can go a long way to make the character feel a little bit more alive. Okay. And how would you do this in lighting? Well, if the materials are built well, adding a very dim light, screen right, would produce those highlights for you. They wouldn't necessarily lift the shadows much, but they would help give you some specular component in there. And it can be just very subtle. You really don't need much of it. You just need enough to fill this area with some information. Something that tells you, okay, even though this is in shadow, that area is still like shiny, It's catching something off screen, some kind of fill light. Okay. Now I think actually we can go even warmer with this. I don't think I've pushed this enough compared to your reference. So this is like really dark and saturated. So let me go and add more drama to this image, okay? Yeah, so now it's a little closer. All right, so I think we got the image pretty close to the reference. We might just want to regain some of these like dark contacts that might have gotten a little too lifted, right? And you can tell that as I go brighter, I'm shifting the hue, so we move from red towards orange. Okay? And as we get darker, we move towards saturated red. Okay. So I think now we can talk about the rest of the image. So you're using the actual reference as the backplate for the image, which is, it's great because you're really trying to match it. But if that's the goal, then technically this paint over would, sort of satisfy the goal, meaning that it will get you very close to the reference you're going for. But let's talk a little bit about the image to begin with. Okay. If I didn't know anything about this image, I would say that it's a pretty strange lighting scenario. And why would I say that? Because there is some kind of light behind. It's outside. It could be headlights from a car. It's low on the ground. That's why they look like headlights, right? And I think they're being used as a motivation for this rim on him, but realistically, light from that side wouldn't hit him on the shoulders that way, right? So it's just there for motivation for his rim. But then there's a stronger rim on his screen left. We don't know what time of day it is, but looking outside, we can tell it's maybe rainy, so this light source must be artificial, some kind of artificial light source. So all of those things are contributing to a feeling that we are confused, right? Because we don't know what time of day it is, we don't know what's outside, we don't know why it's blue, we don't know if those are headlights. And I think that's intentional in the movie, in the sense that I think this is a part of the movie where we're not supposed to know what's real. I think this is probably from Inception or something like that. I might be wrong, but if we wanted to help the image, we probably would want to considerably take down what we see over here. Because this is not really helping, right? We don't really need to see. Let me block this with an alpha. But we don't really need to see all of this area outside. It's a little distracting. And it's making it harder to believe that the light source is coming from screen left. This second rim light on the right is sort of competing with the light from screen left. So, in my opinion, if I didn't know that this is the reference, I would actually go in here and reduce that. You can still keep some kind of gradient in here, but I just would not steal the show, essentially. I wouldn't get it to be so bright that it distracts you and calls for attention. And then in order to reinforce the idea that there's a light coming from screen left, I would actually add a little bit more wash screen left, or like a volumetric, to reinforce the idea that there is a light coming from screen left, or even add some kind of spill. So I would take these values and make them a little brighter, more saturated, maybe towards orange. And I would try to suggest that, yes, there is a light source in the room, that's where the light is coming from. And not only that, I'll also give you some idea of the temperature, so that it will be maybe a little warmer and orange at the bottom here, right? Let me group all of these and give it an alpha so that I can paint without worrying so much. Okay, so all of these will have this alpha, right? So yeah, so by adding some light contribution onto the set, we're able to reinforce the idea that there is a light source and it exists in a set. We can tell how close it is to the character essentially, and it helps to make his lighting feel less staged, because right now he's feeling very staged. And again, I do think that is intentional because they want you to feel like this could be a dream. They don't want you to feel like this could be a natural lighting scenario. But uh, but I would try to introduce a real light source in the set and try to give clues to the audience as to where it is, what temperature it is, and all of that. And then you can add some kind of halation or volumetric contribution. And maybe a little bit less orange, maybe a little dimmer, something like that. And we could actually do the same outside. We could go and add a little bit of volumetric contribution. Like that. So what does that do? This helps to, let's give it the same alpha. This helps reinforce the idea that this is a light source outside, that it's contributing to the scene or that it's very bright. And let me see what else we can do to this image. I think I still feel like I might have lifted the blacks, or the blacks might not be going far enough. Or maybe this is a note that you got specifically to make sure it wouldn't go as dramatic as the reference. Or maybe his shaping just doesn't allow to go that dramatic. Maybe his face is just a little flat. But I think you're in a very good spot. I think you have probably a little bit more range here. You can probably go a little darker in here. So you can push the gradient in this image. Darker, a little cooler, more saturated. So it doesn't feel as flat. Maybe one last thing. I don't know how you're doing the specular highlights on the eyes. There's many ways to go about it, but very often you're not tied to the same light source that is lighting the rest of the character. So I'm not sure if you are decoupling them or you're using the same lights for both the character and his eyes, but I would try to make them a little bit more similar in shape and maybe a little bigger and prominent. Because this one is feeling a little bit too tiny. If this was an animation, that highlight would likely jump in and out of light and become distracting. So I would try and make them a little bigger. And if you have questions on how to do that, you can message me, and I have a few ideas depending on what software you're using. There's many ways to do it. But yeah, that's about it. That's the notes I have for you. And if we go before and after, this is before and this is after. So you should feel like the face is now jumping forward compared to before where our eye was going over here. Now our eye should move to his face because the area, oh, that's creepy, because the area that has the most contrast is now here. Before the most contrast was here, which is no ideal. All right.